very loud. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about understanding dingoes using advanced DNA technologies. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is what are dingoes. So this is a family tree that's showing the relationships of various different dogs from around the world, as well as dingoes and wolves. So dingoes are in this modern domestic dogs, but they share a common ancestor with them, particularly with Asian dogs, and they're also one of the closest relatives of wolves in terms of dogs. And also the closest relative of dingoes to any other living canid is the New Guinea singing dog, which is the wild canid found in New Guinea. So dingoes have been in Australia around 6,000 to 8,000 years, and we know that from genetic dating of the DNA of dingoes, which shows that the lineage or the that family group of dingoes has been distinct from domestic dogs for at least 10 to 12,000 years. The evidence that we have about when dingoes came to Australia is when we look at the fossil record. So the oldest fossil remains from dingoes were found in southern Australia in the Nullarbor, and they've been dated to about 3,500 years. So we know at a minimum dingoes were present in southern Australia 3,500 years ago. So that tells us that they've been here for at least 3,500 years, but up to 10 to 12,000 years. The other thing that we know is that they're a wild canid. So they live in the bush, and they're not reliant on humans or their resources, and that's different from domestic dogs that are reliant on either us for caring for them or our food or waste. And this is another way of showing the genetic relationships or differentiation between dingoes, domestic dogs, and wolves. So the wolves are up here in this corner, the black colours. And the domestic dogs, including the village dogs found in Asia, are in purple colours over here. And dingoes and New Guinea singing dogs are over here in orange, pink, and yellow. And this figure comes from of dingoes that came from dogs, as well as from and other wild canids or canines, but also those both ancient and modern are similar to each other. So dingoes 2,500 years ago are very similar to the dingoes that we have today. They haven't changed dramatically. But what about wild dogs? It's a term that we hear a lot about when we're thinking about dingoes and wild dogs in the bush, and we hear about it when we're talking about managing these animals in the landscape. In the news, I think it's important for many people to understand that Australian states use the term wild dog to refer to feral domestic hybrids, the hybrid descendants of them. And I think that's really important to understand because people often think that wild dogs are a different thing to dingoes. But it's very clear when you look at the definition of these animals that policy does not distinguish between dingoes and feral or stray domestic dogs. But are feral dogs actually an established pest in Australia? We have an idea when we talk about No, well, it's just talk louder, but then the live stream won't hear me. Okay. Okay. animals that were collected all around Australia, that out of only 30 feral dogs, that's less than 1% of those total animals, and 7 here, that they're very rare, they're very uncommon, and there's no or been accidentally left in the bush or lost, rather than actual dogs living in the wild breeding. So now we get into some of the new research that I've been involved in. So in the past, we applied DNA testing to looking at dingoes and separating dingoes from domestic dogs. And we relied on a set of markers that was limited. 23 was about the maximum that we looked at. But advanced DNA technology allows us to look at thousands or even hundreds of thousands of genetic markers. And so that's the work that I've led in the last 5 years. Or thousands of markers. And what we can see from these figures, where basically the orange or the yellow are dingoes, or animals that are mostly dingo, and the blue or the black in this figure over here are the dogs. What this is showing is that dingoes and dogs are easily separatable using advanced DNA technologies, and also that most wild dingoes show limited evidence of recent domestic dog ancestry. That's within the last 10 generations or so. However, in some parts of Australia, there is evidence of back crossing. Again, all of this research is showing that there are very few first-generation dingo cross-dog hybrids in the wild. And what we know from applying these new technologies is that previous DNA testing studies overestimated the occurrence and the extent of recent domestic dog ancestry in dingoes. But what's a back cross? All right, take me through. So a back cross is when you have a hybrid, so the offspring of a dingo and a dog, and then it breeds back with either dogs or dingoes. And then through many generations, what you have is decreasing amounts of dog ancestry in the wild. It's quite a common practice when we're talking about livestock breeding, for example. You might use it to introduce a new strain or breed of sheep, for example, to develop a particular thing that you're interested in, maybe wool type, and then you will back cross it to try to take it back to the original type. And this process explains why we see some evidence of dog ancestry in the wild dingo populations, despite a low occurrence of first-generation hybrids. So basically, we rarely have first-generation hybrids, but when they do happen and they do survive to breed, which is rare, they do contribute sometimes to the population, but over many generations, that reduces, you reduce the amount of dog ancestry that's present in the population. Or at least we think theoretically that that's what happens. So this figure, which I put a little camera thing saying don't take a photo, but it's live stream, so I know some people will. Basically, this is continuing from my research that I published in 2023. So this is an updated map from my 2023 paper, where we've shown the results of over 750 wild canines that I've DNA tested around Australia. And out of those, 573 tested as being more than 99% dingo ancestry, which basically means they haven't had a dog ancestor in at least 6 to 10 generations. Then there were 171 that were shown to be historical or recent dingo back crosses, so animals that
everyone can hear us at the back. Everyone's happy. You did very well, Carly, and we apologise for the... We could hear you. Yeah, we could hear you at the back there.
Alrighty, so like Shelley said earlier, I'm a PhD student at University of New South Wales. Mike's one of my supervisors, and you'll hear from him after me. And I've been working in the Namadgi National Park looking at the dingoes there and how they sort of structure and regulate that alpine ecosystem. So first we have a bit of background and context. So in Australia, dingoes are the terrestrial apex predator. So that means they're the largest and most competitively dominant predator within their ecosystem, and that's much like tigers, crocodiles, lions, sharks, and wolves in their respective ecosystems. So apex predators are commonly credited with keeping ecosystems balanced and in check, and one way via which they can do this is via what we call trophic cascades. And a trophic cascade essentially is just a chain of interactions that cascades through a food web. And quite often they begin at the top of the food web with those apex predators and come down the chain. So a classic example of this comes from the Pacific Northwest in the US, and it involves otters, sea urchins, and kelp. So when the otters are present, they eat the sea urchins, and the sea urchins eat the kelp. So by keeping the urchins under control, the otters allow those kelp forests to thrive and stay healthy. But when the otters are absent, the urchin numbers explode. They strip back all the kelp forest, and then they leave what they call urchin barrens. So you can see just by having that one key apex predator in the ecosystem, it can really shape how healthy it is and the way it looks. So bringing that back to dingoes, here we have a classic sort of Australian food web with the different trophic levels. Dingoes are the apex predator, and they have the capacity to affect all levels of this food chain. So for example, by directly predating on, say, kangaroos or wallabies, the dingoes can indirectly benefit vegetation by reducing grazing pressure by the kangaroos and wallabies. And that's just one way via which a dingo or an apex predator can affect their ecosystem and have those sort of cascading ecosystem effects. Now, cascades such as this and others within food webs can get complicated very quickly when we start considering all the different ecosystem, environment, and human factors. And you can sort of see that here with just a pretty, I guess, doesn't look simple, but pretty simplified food web here of a marine system. So basically, this is what I'm trying to unravel in the Namadgi with a food web similar to this. Trying to understand how dingoes, as the apex predator, regulates that ecosystem. And tonight, I'll be focusing on just one aspect of this, otherwise we'd be here all night. And that's going to be involving the predators in the ecosystem, or the primary predators, that being the dingoes, red foxes, and feral cats. So we know the dingo is the apex predator, but the foxes and cats are what we call a mesopredator, and that just essentially means they're a lower ranking predator within the ecosystem. Now, relationships between apex predators and mesopredators are commonly credited as being quite strong, and that's because such species are often competing for the same food resources and prey, and they sort of just don't get on. Really, the big top predators don't really like having the small ones around. And these interactions are characterized by some key theory that we have, which is the mesopredator release hypothesis, which basically says that mesopredator populations will react inversely to those of apex predators. And that's because the apex predators will either competitively kill the mesopredators because they don't like them, or they'll just sort of exclude them from that ecosystem by being more competitively dominant. And so a good example of this is in the US, where we have coyotes, which are this grey colour one here. Oh, I haven't got my pointer. Let me get it up. So we have coyotes here, and we have wolves. And basically the wolves outcompete the coyotes because they're the more dominant predator, and they sort of compete for food and space resources with the coyotes. And then this in turn allows the red fox populations to increase because the coyote populations have dropped, and previously the foxes would be competing for the resources the most with the coyotes, and now their release decreased their population and the foxes push up. So we see another one of those interacting trophic cascades going across sort of 3 levels or sort of sub-levels. So in Australia, with the predator assemblage that we have, you'd expect that dingoes would act to suppress foxes and cats, and that potentially foxes could also act to suppress the cats as well. So we have a sort of a tripartite predator assemblage where each of those 3 predators can interact with one another. And that's one of the key relationships I've been looking at in Namadgi, and we'll get into what I've found. So for anyone not familiar, Namadgi is basically, I'm sure everyone here should know, is the southern portion of the ACT. Within Namadgi, I've been working across these 4 valley sites, and they're sort of open, grassy valleys, and they're surrounded by montane and subalpine woodland and forest. Within each of these valleys, I've deployed some camera trap monitoring arrays, which are represented by these red dots. So each of those red dots is a camera trap. We've been using those to monitor the dingo, fox, and cat populations, as well as other wildlife, but today we're just talking about dingoes, foxes, and cats. And obviously we got heaps of cool pictures with these. So I've got plenty of good dingo pictures so everyone can see them. So we got your classic tan dingo here. We got a black and white one. And then we got a little pack here with the pups and a black one. We got another tan one in the snow with its winter coat on. And then we got plenty of little pup pictures as well. There's some following mum. And then some more ones here. So you get some pretty cool pictures. Aside from capturing these cute pup pictures, the camera traps allow us to look at the populations for the different predators and look at their activity levels. So on this graph here, we have dingo activity at each of the 4 sites that I showed you before. Now the y-axis that we have here is detections per 100 camera trap nights. So that basically means, for example, with Bobian Valley that we got here, this one, for every 100 nights that a camera trap was out, on average it got about 5 detections of dingoes. But the key takeaway we have here is that we had sites with high dingo activity and then 2 sites with low dingo activity. And that's really important because that just allows us to investigate how the foxes and the cats are responding to different levels of dingo activity. So here we have foxes. And we can already see, like the theory that I described before with the mesopredator release, that at the sites where we have high dingo activity, we had lower red fox activity. And then the 2 sites where there's low dingo activity, we had quite high fox activity. So this sort of suggesting that fox activity may be suppressed by dingo activity. And if we look at this in a bit more detail here, we can see sort of a way in which the foxes are responding to the dingoes. So the graph on the left shows us the daily activity patterns for dingoes and red foxes. So basically over a 24-hour period, when are these predators active? Whilst the graph on the right shows us how different these patterns are at each site and whether or not it's a meaningful difference. And going forward, if the bars are this blue color, it means it's a meaningful difference. So here at every site, the difference in the activity levels of dingoes and foxes was meaningful. But when we look at the plot on the left first, we can see that there is quite a distinct difference between the dingo and the fox activity. The fox activity sort of drops off here before that peak in the morning activity for the dingoes, and then it picks up again later in the evening, sort of after that peak dingo activity. Now, this pattern alone doesn't necessarily mean that dingoes are causing red foxes to shift their activity patterns, but it is somewhat supported by the graph on the right side. So we can see that at the sites where there is high dingo activity, which are these 2 bars here, the difference between the dingoes and foxes is much greater than at the 2 sites where there's lower dingo activity. So together these findings sort of suggest that dingo activity is suppressing overall fox activity, as the plot on the left would suggest, but foxes are able to sort of coexist with the dingoes by shifting when they are active throughout the day to avoid confrontation with the dingoes. Now we'll have a look at how the feral cats fit into this picture. So overall, cat activity was low across the 4 sites compared to dingoes and foxes, but you can sort of see that there's a sort of similar trend with the foxes that the foxes had to dingoes. So at the sites where there's high dingo activity, we had less feral cat activity, and then there was more feral cat activity at the sites with less dingo activity. But when we look at the daily activity patterns for the dingoes and the cats, it's a bit more complicated. Although there's sort of a difference in the morning, for the most part of the day, they have similar activity patterns and they overlap. And the graph on the right sort of represents this mixed pattern where we only have 2 of the sites with a meaningful difference, and each site represents a high dingo activity and a low dingo activity site. So overall, there's no real clear link between the dingo activity levels and whether or not that affected the feral cat's daily activity levels, and rather it was a sort of site-specific trend. So that got us thinking, if the cats are responding to overall pressure of dingoes, as this graph sort of suggests, how are they coexisting with dingoes at the sites with high dingo activity if they're not shifting their daily activity patterns to avoid dingoes? And for this, we had a look at the habitat use by the cats. And what we can see here is that the high sites, the sites with high dingo activity, which are these 2 here, that the cats were tended to be more frequently detected by the cameras that were in the closed-in forested habitat types compared to the edge habitat and the open habitat. Open habitat being out in the open grassland and the edge being on the edge of the open and the closed. But when we compare that to the 2 sites with low dingo activity, we can see that the habitat use was much more even across the 3 habitat types for the cats. So this basically, when there's a lot of dingoes, the cats want to use that more sheltered forested habitat so they can, probably run up a tree if they feel threatened by a dingo. But when there's less pressure and threat from the dingoes, the cats are much more happy to go out and use these edge and open habitats because there's just a little less threat. And lastly, we had a look for any potential relationships between the foxes and the cats. Now, although fox and cat activity does sort of overlap in the evening, it does sort of separate out for the rest of the day. And that sort of subtle variation is captured by the plot on the right here. So again, we can see when there's high fox activity, the difference in the activity levels of the cats and foxes is much greater, and it's meaningful, whereas these ones were not meaningful at all. So basically, at the low sites, the cats and the foxes didn't really have different daily activity levels, but at the sites with lots of foxes, they did. So the cats aren't consistently avoiding the foxes in the time over the day, but they do when the fox pressure is high. So if we bring this all together, the dingoes, overall dingo activity acts to suppress both fox and cat activity. Foxes respond quite consistently to this, and they shift when they're active throughout the day to avoid dingoes, depending on the site they're at. And the cats are a bit more flexible. So instead of showing one single response, instead their behavior depends on which predator is the greatest threat locally. So at the sites where we had high dingo activity but low fox activity, the cats would choose to avoid the greatest threat, which was the dingoes, and they'd use the more sheltered forested habitat to avoid those dingoes. But when the dingo activity was low, which we think allows the fox activity to be high, the cats then have a different threat, which is the foxes. And to avoid them, they use the temporal avoidance, so they shift their daily activity patterns to avoid the foxes. So if the dingoes are absent, we'd expect that fox activity would increase and be more active throughout the day. And in this kind of situation, cats might use more open habitat more freely. But at the same time, the cats might have to shift when they're active in the day to avoid the foxes who now are much more active because there's less dingoes. And so what does this all mean in context of management? In Australia, this is important because both red foxes and feral cats are a major impact on our native wildlife. So if dingoes help to keep these introduced predators in check either by reducing their populations or altering their behaviour, so altering their behaviour being that change in the daily activity patterns or using different habitat types, the dingo could help to play an important role in conserving our native prey species. So understanding these interactions within these food webs isn't just an academic thing. It has implications for biodiversity, especially given the extinction crisis we have in Australia at the moment. So today we've covered just one aspect via which dingoes can structure ecosystems and could potentially benefit Australian biodiversity. And if things weren't already complicated enough, dingoes might not even be the apex predators this photo from Nemaji might suggest. So what do I know what I'm talking about? Thank you.
Thanks, James. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming along. Well, I'm going to start by asking you a few questions, and I want you to answer if you can, with hands or voices. And these questions, the answers that I get, I've asked them to quite a few audiences, they differ between the audiences. First question I want to hit you with is, are dingoes native, introduced, or feral? Come on, speak up. Any ferals? No ferals. Introduced? No introduced. Okay. Now, what should we call them? Dingoes? Wild dogs? Warrigal? Are they just dogs? What do they look like? They're yellow and they live on Fraser Island. Do they structure our ecosystems? And well, finally, I think we've got a biased audience here because I get very different answers sometimes. Should we conserve them or exterminate them? So in my talk, I'm going to explore some of those questions and pretty much from more of an Australia-wide perspective as much as possible. I don't know, to be honest, I don't necessarily know how to answer all of those questions, and a lot of the times the audiences are really vexed about how to answer them, and for some of them I think it's really difficult. But anyway, we do know that dingoes arrived at least 3,500 years ago in Australia, and the timing of their arrival and the extinction of the thylacine and the Tasmanian devil from the mainland suggests that the dingo almost certainly did it. And well, as Kylie was talking about before, we think that they're descended from the ancestor of a domestic dog or a primitive domestic dog, but we're not really sure. Primitive dog? Well, it's confusing, isn't it? It's hard. But at the moment, they are Australia's largest terrestrial predator, but they're not our largest predator. I mean, they get done by crocodiles. And also, and I guess just to bring you into the debate, and it's all contested, there's another group of scientists who argue that, well, dingoes are just a domestic dog and we should call them dogs. And they're just, not really any different from the dogs in Asia. So now I was going to just put up some pictures here about, well, what did dingoes look like? And so one of the things that we did years ago was we thought, well, what do dingoes? We asked this very question. And so one of the things that we did was we went and found the earliest images of dingoes that we could find. And so these are 5 18th century images of dingoes, so images made at First Fleet times. Or this one down here was actually a painting that was commissioned by Joseph Banks. So he described in his notebook what a dingo looked like when he came out to Australia with Cook, and then he went back to the UK and got a very famous artist George Stubbs to draw him the dingo to his satisfaction. So that's probably the earliest image. But anyway, the main take-homes I want you to get from this is that, well, the colour's a bit variable. Now, whether we consider the colour reliable or not is another thing, but it's variable. But there are some things that are quite consistent amongst all these images. Maybe I'll ask you guys to tell me what's consistent about them. Ears, tail. Okay, so there's some consistent characteristics, which probably all of us could probably say, well, actually, they all look a bit dingo-ish. So we thought, well, that was pretty interesting. They look dingo-ish, but there's a lot of variability. But there's these characteristics with the tail and the ears, the body shape, and the head, the size of the head. It's all quite distinctive. So then we went to and had a look for skins. So we went and found 19th century museum specimens of dingoes, and there's not a great deal of them around. But these are 5 ones that we found. 2 of them are in France. This one's in England. That one's in that one's in England too. And this one's in Victoria. But so these animals, 2 of them are from Sydney. One of them's from Wentworth on the junction of the Murray and the Darling. It was collected right at on the edge of settlement at the time. And this one is just after Perth started in 1842. But anyway, the main take home I want you to get from this is same as the last slide really, is that the colour's pretty variable. There's a sable one here, and this one's a bit sable. So by sable, I mean it's like dark on the back. This one's black and tan. This is like a classic yellow one. And then this one's white. But anyway, there's a lot of variability in the colours. And so I don't think the colour or what a dingo looks like, or it's got a dark back, is necessarily any indication that it's not a dingo. But characteristic with the paintings is they've all got these pointy ears, the brushy tail, the big broad head, long snout. So there's some very characteristic things that are consistent with the paintings. And then just getting on with this idea of the colours of dingoes, and I have come across this rug that was made in the Adelaide district in 1870, so about 30 years after Adelaide was started. And I thought, well, all the colours in there are quite interesting. There's most of them are yellow, like we probably think that dingoes should look like. But there's black and tans, there's a sable, and there's a brindle as well. So it makes me think that a lot of these, variations of colour have been around for a long time and are unlikely to be due to hybridisation. Right. Now, this is one, Kylie already beat me to this one, but I want to, ask you about names of dingoes. What's in a name? And, I especially, I've travelled around the country a lot, and I never, ever see signs advertising that people are killing the dingoes. So I go to, lots of properties, and there's often a sign at the beginning of the property, and they're all killing wild dogs. No one ever kills dingoes. And so I started thinking about the names that we use to describe dingoes quite a lot. The word dingo is an indigenous word from the Sydney region. But there's another name that's often used for dingoes. I heard it before, warrigal, which is another word from the Sydney region and also from the ACT. And there's lots of other indigenous names for dingoes that existed and exist across Australia. Another term that was widely used in early literature is the term native dog. In a lot of colonial journals and things, I'll talk about native dogs. And then I also been very interested in this term wild dog. Now, in many ways, I think that wild dog is a euphemism for dingo, and it's just a name that's come into public language, like government language, that we only ever killed wild dogs. And I was quite cynical of, thinking, well, maybe they were all dingoes once in our language and we've turned them into wild dogs, but that's not right. I think they were dingoes in New South Wales and Queensland and lots of other places, but it turns out that in Victoria and South Australia, wild dog has been the predominant term used to describe dingoes all along. Well, I think, and I'm going to show you some evidence now. So what I did to get at that question was I looked at the Gazetteer of Australian place names. So every place name in Australia, like, Dingo Mountain or Wild Dog Creek, is officially exist on this register, which is the Gazetteer of Australian place names. And I had a look at the geography of these 4 names that are commonly used to describe dingoes across Australia. And so what I found was that there's never been any dingoes in the ACT. There's not a single place in the ACT with called dingo this or native dog that or warrigal that or wild dog that. So I don't know what that means. There's a dingo named place in Tasmania where there was never any dingoes. So you can see this is very reliable information. But no, what's quite interesting though is that the word dingo is most widely used in New South Wales, Queensland, the Northern Territory, even Western Australia. And the term wild dog is mainly used in South Australia and Victoria in a trade-off with dingo. So there seems to be that there's also some of this has probably got to do with the language of the different colonies and remembering that they were colonies with their own dialects. And people were, they didn't have dingoes in Victoria. They always had wild dogs. And so, and again, like native dog and warrigal are mainly in New South Wales. And anyway, so who's been to any of these places? Dingo Beach, Mount Warrigal, Native Dog Road, Wild Dog Creek Road. Oh, some people have been. Right. And so Kylie talked a little bit about hybridisation with domestic dogs. So there's always, ever since dogs turned up in Australia, there's been concern or thought that there might be hybridisation with dingoes, and it has happened. It does happen. And I guess one of the turning points in our thinking about that was a study that was done by CSIRO researchers in the 1970s and 80s, and they killed thousands of dingoes across the country for these big studies, and they boiled them down and got the skulls. They're all in a national wildlife collection here in Canberra, and they measured them with calipers and looked at the shape. And then they had some animals that they deliberately interbred with dogs to look at the shape of the offspring of those animals. And they concluded that hybridisation changes the shape of dingo skulls. And then with these big analysis of the whole data set, they concluded that dingoes were hybridised across much of Australia. Though later research with modern genetics, like Kylie's been doing, and Alan Wilton, who was previous at the University of New South Wales, have been able to give us a little bit more insight into the extent of that hybridisation Kylie was talking about before. And so I've got a map here that I've stolen from one of Kylie's papers, and I don't want to harp on about it because Kylie's already talked about this. But basically, animals that are effectively or predominantly dingo with very little evidence of recent hybridisation occur across most of the country in the samples that Kylie's analysed. I think this is a map here of 307 wild animals that were caught, and there's only a handful of domestic dogs and not very much evidence of recent hybridisation. But I'm going to get back to this about what dingoes look like, and these are animals that Kylie's tested, all from the ACT. And there's this classic yellow one, there's a brindle one, and there's a patchy one, and a black and tan one. And, what did you find, Kylie? What were your test results? They're all dingoes? Yeah, okay. And they're just a whole range of colours. So when you look at it, you don't ignore the colour. Look at the shape. Right. A lot of my research, and also over the last 20 years has been thinking about their roles in ecosystems, and James is doing this work in Namadgi. And across the country, I think we can pretty safely say that dingoes suppress populations of foxes and cats because, well, they hate them. And wherever you go across the country as well, if there's an area with lots of dingoes, there's hardly any kangaroos or wallabies. So they suppress their numbers because they eat their prey. But there's other things that we've found that there's more small mammals in areas where there's dingoes. And the best explanation for that is because there's less foxes and cats. And so our native mammals do better. And the other thing is that these effects translate to plants and other aspects of the ecosystem. And one obvious thing across much of the country is that the understory vegetation tends to be denser. And that's just because there's less grazing pressure. And for me, I'm not sure how well you guys are going to see this, but a lot of this was rammed home years ago. I was actually doing my PhD, I think, when I discovered these maps. I was scrolling through the volumes of the parliamentary papers of the different states up in Fisher Library at the University of Sydney on level 8 in the library, and a place where no one ever goes. And I found these two maps at the top. And it's a map of Queensland. I'll try to explain what I'm seeing here. This map here is a map, and it's covered in dots. And each dot represents 5 dingo scalps that were handed in for bounty payments. Okay, and the map here on the other side is the same map for foxes. Now, at the back, all I want you to get is that there's a dark area around here. And there's a light area here, and the words that say there's a line, and it says main sheep area. Okay? So dingoes are really bad for sheep. So people went to a lot of effort to get rid of the dingoes in the sheep area. And the foxes erupted in the sheep area. Okay? So there's a real an opposite pattern. And I got an assistant to grid everything up. You don't have to do this anymore. There's software that does it, and she counted how many dots there were in each part of the grid, and we graphed them, and we showed that there was an inverse relationship. And then we did the same for similar maps that were published around the same time in Western Australia, and found, again, a very similar relationship. So if you get rid of the dingoes, you get more foxes. And so over the last 20 years, my team and I have been following the ecosystem in the Strzelecki Desert, so on the edge of New South Wales and the border with South Australia, and we've been sampling for small mammals and kangaroos and things on either side of the dingo fence. And I've put up some graphs here. I don't really want you to worry too much about what's in the graphs, except think about the colours, okay? So the graphs on this side are on the dingo side of the fence, and the graphs on this side are on the very few dingo side of the fence. So this is New South Wales, and this is South Australia, and these are small mammals on the top, mainly things like this dusky hopping mouse, and the bottom are the predators. Okay, and each predator's got a different colour. I'll do the bottom one first. This graph, the colour, can you see that the colour? It's mainly there's a lot of purple and a lot of blue. There's dingoes and barn owls are the main predators that we're seeing in South Australia. And in this one, it's foxes and cats, okay? And I think we've seen dingoes twice in 20 years in our surveys. So we drive around at night on the back of a car with a spotlight, and we've been going there 3 times a year, and every time we go there, or 4 places, we probably, drive for 50, 60 kilometres, counting what we see. We also do trapping, and so a few times a year. And I don't know, can you guys see that these graphs are really different? Okay. This graph here, it's mainly these dusky hopping mice, which is a beautiful animal. And in fact, I know that we've caught about 6,500 dusky hopping mice in that period in South Australia. And on this graph, where it's really quite blank, we've caught 453. So, but it's just completely different. And Alan Newsom, who is a CSIRO scientist who also worked in this area, described it as two separate ecological universes. It's that different with the ecology on each side of the fence. So, and it is, because the vegetation is different as well. And years ago, when I was starting this project, I found this satellite image. So this is an image of this is the border with New South Wales and South Australia. And then this is the dingo fence, and the dingo fence goes off into South Australia. And I don't know, can you guys see that there's a line there? That's the dingo fence. And the colours are a bit hard to interpret from the satellite imagery, but it's characteristic of what's happening with the vegetation of the soil. But what I think you can very clearly say from that image is it's different. So since that time, we've been doing, we'll do surveys of kangaroos, and like those same surveys that I showed you before with the graphs with the foxes and the cats, I think we've seen 5,500 kangaroos in our surveys in New South Wales and 13 in South Australia over the 20 years. And there's a map here where in the 70s, they did aerial surveys of kangaroos and showed that there's this massive concentration of kangaroos. This red area corresponds with that New South Wales, well, this is this red area there. So there's this concentration of kangaroos on the edge of the dingo fence in New South Wales and South Australia, where there's no dingoes. Anyway, we've been looking at kangaroos' impacts on ecosystems in New South Wales. I've been working in Sturt National Park, and this is a fenced-off area that we had where we kept kangaroos out in the drought quite a few years ago now, but you can see there's a very clear effect of the kangaroo grazing, and that's in a national park. There's no sheep, there's no goats, just kangaroo grazing. So there's a very strong effect of kangaroo grazing on these systems because there's just so many kangaroos without the dingoes. So James has been doing similar studies in Namadgi, and as James described before, he's found quite similar evidence or relationships between dingoes and foxes as what we've found elsewhere in the country. But he didn't mention that he's also been finding similar relationships with the grazing impacts of kangaroos as well. Now, I understand that there's quite a few kangaroos in the ACT. Well, Namadgi's got a lot of kangaroos as well. And one of the things that James has done is he's built these fenced areas, pretty much the same as the area that I showed you up in Sturt National Park, where we've got a fenced area and where we keep the kangaroos out. And what we've found is that the difference in the vegetation height between what's inside the exclosure and outside is greatest where there's very few dingoes. So the grazing effects of kangaroos is greatest where there's very few dingoes. So it's a very similar relationship to what we've found elsewhere in the country. So so dingoes are having these strong effects in Namadgi, just like they are everywhere else. So dingoes have strong effects on ecosystems, but they're hard to live with. Okay, and it's unequivocal that, you know, if you grow sheep, it's very hard to have dingoes around. And so one of the big challenges that we have is that we want to, as a society, use who here wears wool? Yeah, people still wear wool. Who eats lamb chops? Well, people still eat lamb chops. We have a sheep industry that exists because there's very few or no dingoes. And as a society, we probably need to maintain that to some extent. But how can we do that and try to maintain the dingoes as well? That's the big challenge that we have. I'm from New South Wales. One of the things that really dislike that goes on in New South Wales is that New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife kills more dingoes than anyone else. And they do it basically, they load helicopters up full of poison baits, and they just throw poison baits out the windows. And I think that's the worst situation to get into for managing. So, and they're doing that in the national parks. So on the premise that the dingoes will come out of the national parks into grazing lands. I think we need to work really, really hard to try and find other methods that we can hopefully have the dingoes in the national parks, and well, not so many dingoes out of the national parks, but hopefully that, because what's happening in New South Wales is they're getting rid of the dingoes in the national parks as well. So there are methods. People trap them, and I don't know, if you travel around in New South Wales, the most likely way you'll see a dingo is like this, hanging off a tree. We can use fencing, but it's very expensive. It's very difficult. But there are these non-lethal techniques that are emerging, and guardian dogs are a useful method. We can have big dogs to protect herds of sheep. And another method that we're particularly interested to try in the future is fladry, and this is the method that's used a lot in North America, where people put up these fences of flags, and they move them around a little bit, but it disrupts the movement patterns of the wolves in this case, and hopefully deters them from moving into sheep grazing areas. So that's a method that we'd like to try in the future to see if we can, kill less dingoes. Anyway, just to conclude, dingoes are widespread. They're across the country, and the animals that we have across the country are dingoes. They're not wild dogs. Most dingoes in the ACT have no recent dog ancestry. They're pure. But for me, what's really important too is that dingoes perform an important ecological function as apex predators. But the real challenge that I like to think is that, and what I've been saying for years cheekily, is that we need to try and find places where maybe the wild dogs can be dingoes, I think, is something we really need to work towards. So thank you very much.
Okay, so this was the time. Thank you. That was awesome. All three of you are amazing. This was the time we were going to, if you haven't bought a raffle ticket or you would like to donate to have a little bit of a stretch, you can do that. Josh has a box there, so he's going to walk around and grab any questions. So if you've got questions, please put your hand up so he can come and grab them. If you don't need a walk around and you just want to put the questions in there, then we can just keep moving along, but we do need those questions in the box fairly quickly. Any questions? Yep, up the back there. Any other questions? Yep, just down here. Anyone else that needs to buy a raffle ticket tonight? We're all done. Okay, and then if you wanted to do any more donations, the QR codes are everywhere, so you can jump on board there. If everyone's done with the raffle tickets, we'll wait for these guys to come back. Yep, so we'll just have a quick break, everyone. Stretch your legs. Minutes out, so we got a few things. We've got a few questions here that Josh is going to ask the questions, and then I'm going to leave a speaker with you three, and you can decide who answers each of the questions. We have really not had much time to look at the questions, so it's a bit random. So you guys might have to just share. You all know lots about dingoes.
So the first question is, if dingoes, foxes, cats all come out at different times, what does that mean? Does that mean that prey species basically have to hide 24/7?
All right, I'll start, and then Michael have a think about it and take over, I'm sure. For a start, dingoes, foxes, and cats have different prey species, or they have overlapping prey. There's been quite a few studies definitely on overlap in especially in fox and cat diets. A lot of studies have done that, and I think also sometimes they include dingoes in that. So most of the time the dingoes are going to be going for the wallabies and the roos, whereas the foxes and the cats are going for those smaller prey species, so brush-tailed possums, rabbits. That being said, I did see a crazy video yesterday of a fox taking down a pretty big eastern grey kangaroo in a little water hole, and the thing was trying to drown the fox, but the fox got it in the end, which I was surprised. So maybe foxes can get way bigger prey than I initially thought. But in terms of the vigilance, I mean, I think the kangaroos, especially in the Namadgi, are always sort of on alert, and they group up quite a lot. So they've always got someone looking around, I think, and they're quite got to be quite careful. I don't know if the dingoes do much at night. I don't think they do. If they do, yeah. Yeah.
Most tiny little animals are restricted to being active at night. So, got to eat, got to live. It's a dangerous world.
Next one is, how effective are fox lights in deterring dingoes, and what is the best multi-method approach to deterrence?
Linda? We've got a guardian dog expert over here, and
Sure. Go for it.
Well, as far as I know, fox lights can be effective, but they tend to only be effective for a short period of time, because over time the animals habituate to it. So that's the issue. So if it's used intermittently and not constantly, like for example during a high risk situation, like during lambing for the initial period, they can be quite effective. Deterrents in general all share that issue, that over time the animals will habituate to it. I suppose guardian animals can be called a deterrent. They are very effective, and they will work very well over a very long period of time. Does that answer the question? Yeah, it's like it's a flashing light at a random pattern. Some also have sounds associated with it, like an alarm sound that goes on and off. But the basic principle, it's like a flashing light.
Well, we can add on to that. That's also what Mike and I are interested with the future stuff. If you read these posters with the fladry, like Linda said, if you just keep fladry fencing up, that waving flags, most likely the animals are going to get used to it. So we want to sort of look at how you move those things around, maybe at different times of the year and when they're most relevant. So you might have, the farmer might have a set few paddocks during lambing. He's like, this is my lambing paddock this year. Let's put the fladry fencing on here this year. And the next year we'll move it to a different one. So it's some element of change that those animals aren't used to add into it.
So donate some money so that James can do the research.
Obviously, genetic diversity is important, but what are the specific worries if dingoes keep with low genetic diversity? What would happen to their species?
So basically, as you get more and more inbred, you can adapt less. So if there's a challenge like a disease or having to adapt to climate change, you're going to be less effective at adapting to that or changing to meet that challenge. Also, as you get more and more inbred, you're more likely to get diseases and congenital defects and also have issues with reproduction. So you might be more likely to have spontaneous miscarriages or abortions or stillbirths. A range of different ways. There's one option which is called genetic rescue, where you will take a population that's more diverse and move it into an area so that they can contribute to their genetic diversity and basically mix it up. Or one of the other ways might be to stop the lethal control pressure and allow dingoes to increase their population sizes and thus recover their genetic diversity. But that's more challenging, and we need to study it.
I have 3 on this one. It's basically the same question, but one more. This will be your final one. Why are dingoes controlled in our national parks? And is the government/policy makers taking notice of the DNA evidence? And are dingoes protected in ACT national parks? So it's pretty much all the same kind of question.
Okay, so dingoes are managed across the landscape because of their potential risk to livestock, and that's why we manage them inside of national parks, because of the threat that they might pose outside of the national park to farmers that have boundaries. So that's why we do the lethal control in national parks. The next one was, the next part of that was our government's listening to the DNA testing. So some governments are shifting policy based on the new science showing that there's limited evidence of recent domestic dog ancestry. So Victoria particularly has shifted policy, particularly in part of the state. So northwestern Victoria, there was a population of dingoes that was identified, and they're now fully protected on public and private land, which is quite astonishing. Dingoes in eastern Victoria, though, are largely being managed in the same way that they were before. New South Wales is effectively not doing any changes, and neither are any of the other states that I've seen so far. ACT is another state that is shifting in some ways, so there is some action potentially happening at the moment to move them from being a pest species to a managed native species.
Yeah, the ACT would be the most progressive, and New South Wales is probably the. Well, New South Wales, but I think is the hardest. Oh, and yeah, but anyway, they can compete. Anyway. They've got a dingo place name though.
Here we have our raffle that we're doing right now. So what we do is pull out a raffle ticket, and you get first prize and choose what you want. So we're going to do that quickly, and I'm going to leave that with Taylor and Ash.
Okay.
I think it's still alive.
Is it? It so is. Alrighty, if you guys have bought any raffle tickets, find them now.